Welcome. Like many others, you probably wonder what all the hype is about. More friends are playing it, more people are making content for it. You're interested in getting into the game, but you're hesitant. Is it somewhere like World of Warcraft and its universe? Or maybe it's more like Guild Wars 2? In this video we'll cover some things that might be good for you as a beginner or someone that wants to get into the game to know. So where do we start? To make things easier, we'll split this video into a few segments. If you're interested in a specific part, feel free to use the timestamps within the video. You might have heard some people call Final Fantasy XIV a RPG MMO rather than an MMORPG, which bears a ton of truth. This game contains a beautifully crafted story, which truly is one of a kind that rivals most of the single players story-focused RPGs that you'll play. It's a story you definitely should experience, especially if you find enjoyment in old-school Japanese role-playing games. I won't talk about the story itself, in order to not spoil anything. For now, all you need to know is that the story and leveling are tied together. When you enter the world of Eorzea for the first time, you will level by doing the main story quest, also known as the MSQ. It will continuously be seen in the top left corner. This is mandatory to progress your character, as well as unlocking a ton of features. Because of this, your first time playing and leveling will feel very streamlined. The MSQ will also introduce you to different PvE formats, such as dungeons and trials, which we'll speak more about later. For now, just think of them as multiplayer interactions that you'll do as part of the MSQ. A quick disclaimer is that many struggle with the MSQ due to its sheer length. It is a story that developed over the span of almost 10 years. This means that many quests towards the earlier days of the game go under more typical MMO conventions, such as filler and fetch quests. Although the quality of these heavily improves the further you get into the game. So with that said, you might be asking, well, just how much game is your MSQ wise then? Looking at the screen, you'll get a good idea. It's also worth memorizing the acronyms for these expansions. A heads up related to the previous part is that although it's heavily subjective, a somewhat common consensus tends to be that A Realm Reborn in particular feels quite a bit slow compared to the later installments. However, if you enter with the mindset of wanting to experiencing a long, ever-evolving story over time, you'll soon see that this won't affect you at all. After each expansion lands, there's also additional MSQ added in the patches to come. This may serve to conclude an existing story arc or starting a new one. Due to this, each expansion will hence end with a point number patch, leading into the next one. As of this video, Endwalker recently released, referred to as 6.0. The game philosophy of Final Fantasy XIV differs a fair bit to other games. The developers are very appreciated, and for the right reasons. The baseline reason is that they never depend on FOMO or scare tactics in order to retain players. Instead, they simply deliver a very solid game in order to do so. The developers don't feel a need to tie you down to busy or weekly work that has become obliviously popular in other titles nowadays. You can also take breaks from this game and come back to find that you can easily catch up to others. Other than this, the developers also have a solid reputation of listening to their player base and their feedback. Generally speaking, who knows what the player of a game wants more than the players, right? The reason all of this works is because Final Fantasy XIV isn't a hyper-competitive game in its nature. Your time is respected, no matter what kind of player you are. You're also always heavily encouraged to play together with your friends, even despite level differences. A good example of this is how they treat old content. All old content, such as low-level dungeons, keep a good level of relevance. Let's say you got a friend that recently started playing. You want to play together, but he's only level 15. This is coincidentally where you unlock your first dungeon. Even if you are level 89, you can still team up and enter the dungeon together. What happens is that the level 89 player will be downscaled to match the dungeon. You will even receive XP, making it favorable to play with your friend. This is further encouraged by the armory bonus. Imagine that your highest level job is level 50. You want to try a new class. You will now receive a 100% XP bonus until you reach 50. Due to the philosophy of the game, you will also find that the community is very different from more competitive MMOs. Starting playing, you will quickly find yourself surrounded with people of different kinds, and there is a huge variety of communities around. Maybe you enjoyed role-playing, you'll find that. Maybe you prefer talking and spending your time with people with the same mindset as you can easily find that as well. You can basically find communities for all types of players and personalities around. Simply ask players around you, or even straight up Google for it based on your server and data center. Coming mainly from World of Warcraft, and more specifically the arena/PvP scene, I can say the difference has been astronomical. There, you will essentially be forced into toxic situations by the hour, whether you like it or not. I can't tell you how many times post an arena game I've had people going haywire. Trying to play with random people is usually a dead end there as well.
Oh, I'm beamed. Oh, watch out. Wall.
Whereas in Final Fantasy XIV it's not nearly as common. The probably greatest reason for this is the general dislike for this kind of people and its behavior. The people around will shun and actively filter these people away. Since I started playing this game 3-4 months ago, I have again and again been baffled at how inviting and open players are, and would definitely rate it as a main selling point of this game. Now that we covered some of the more theoretical things, how does the game itself function? We'll start by looking a bit on the class/job system. Classes, or jobs as they are referred to in Final Fantasy XIV, is a big reason many get hooked. Before venturing onto the classes themselves, let's quickly sort out how the system in this game works. Unlike many other MMOs, where you need several characters to experience all classes, you can experience all of them with just one character in this game. This is done by changing your weapon archetype, and later down the lane, your job/soul crystal. Example. You might start the game off as a Lancer, but after seeing others play, you'll feel more interested in a Warrior. You now simply go and do a quick talk quest in order to unlock the class, alongside with a starting weapon. You can now change from a Lancer to a Warrior by simply changing the Lancer weapon, a lance, or a spear, into a great axe. All classes have their own set of hotbars and skills. Looking at the screen, you'll see the different classes icons. There are a few things to note that might differ to other games. The first is that all classes in Final Fantasy XIV has a bound role. For instance, Lancer, that will later become Dragoon, is a melee DPS. This part is set in stone. You can't change spec or such within a class. Same goes for Gladiator, that will later become Paladin. This is strictly a tank, with no exceptions. A good thing to keep in mind is that all classes are acquired and functions differently. What I mean by this is that some classes are locked behind levels/expansion ownage. Some classes start in their specialized state, others does not. A good rule of thumb to know how is by looking at their starting level. If a class starts at level 1, they are not yet evolved. This happens at level 30, meaning if a class starts at 30 or above, it's already evolved. Looking at the screen, we'll have some quick information regarding prerequisites. Down in the description, I'll have a video link that showcases the jobs later into the game, where you might find some inspiration. While at it, let's touch the gatherers and crafters as well. They are, by all means, fledged out jobs with their own gear, skills and utilities after all. As you probably guessed, one character can learn all of those trade skills as well. The trade job comes in two categories, gatherers and crafters. As the name dictates, the gatherer jobs will gather raw goods based on description. The crafter job follows the same pattern as well. I doubt you'll be overly amazed when you hear that an armorer makes armor or such, or that an alchemist will create potions and such. There is, however, a job, carpentry, you might be familiar with. It specializes in furniture and housing items. You can craft for your player and guild houses. A good note, despite being the main furniture job, all crafting jobs can make a variety of housing items. Alchemists produce flower arrangements and fountains, weavers can make rugs, etc. You might have previously heard how playing Sims Final Fantasy XIV Edition, or taking screenshot where your buddies is the ultimate endgame. Well, this isn't wrong, but neither is anything else. Because there's no forced content, people experience the game in a more casual manner in this game. Some spend their day simply chatting and hanging out with their friends, while others gather a plethora of outfits and make fashion-oriented content. Like mentioned just a minute ago, there's also the crafting and gathering endgame, which ultimately spins into guild making, which is also a legitimate endgame. Others prefer spending all their time with their houses and making the ultimate crib. The list really is endless. For the sake of a fresh breath of air, this is how Square Enix themselves define the game. However, some things are missing. The structure of PvE within Final Fantasy XIV is somewhat simple, but yet very fun. There's a variety of formats, just about enough to keep everyone occupied based on preferences. Outside of the more solo-oriented story PvE, there's 5 main formats. Dungeons, 4-player activity. This is easy content with no modular difficulties such as Mythic Plus. There is, however, a plethora of dungeons to experience. During my last recount, I got to somewhere between 80 to 85 in grand total. Trials, 8-player activity. 1 boss, You'll be introduced to these during the MSQ. Many are mandatory and serves as a climax for a story development. The normal difficulty varies a tad bit, but are most of the time manageable even for a complete beginner. There is, however, a higher difficulty that bears a ton more challenge, usually called extreme trials. It's a version of the previous trials, just with tons of added mechanics and multipliers. Raids. 8-player activities. Outside of dungeons, raids could be seen as the baseline PvE setting in Final Fantasy XIV. Raids are usually optional content, used to conclude or start story arcs. Unlike trials, there is just not one extra difficulty setting, but two. The first, Savage. Those are considered tough content, which enhances the fight again with mechanics and tougher multipliers. There is most of the time a Savage version of each raid. There is, however, also Ultimate Raids. These are the content the most dedicated of PvEers will look into. Since their introduction in Stormblood, there has so far been 3 of them released scarcely. Alliance Raid. 24-player activity. A larger PvE setting, where 3 groups of 8 people each ventures into a raid dungeon with several bosses. This content is optional, with an exception of ARR. No modular difficulty, with a general difficulty of between easy to medium. There is, however, one more format that many tend to miss out on. It's called Deep Dungeon, and is something you must check out if you're at all interested in roguelike or dungeon crawler games. The first Deep Dungeon is called Palace of the Dead, and features a separate level/progression system. Palace of the Dead got 200 floors, and you'll enter and clear segments of 10 floors at a time, with a boss at every 10 floors, for 20 in total. This can be done with a group or solo. However, managing to do this activity solo will reward you with the Necromancer title. So if you're a player looking for that tough solo challenge, the game got you covered. As a main PvP player of MMOs, I went into Final Fantasy XIV looking for a new PvP thrill after the downward spiral that is WoW PvP after years of mismanagement. I had beforehand heard that Final Fantasy XIV PvP wasn't that great, which, unfortunately, still holds true in my view. However, there is PvP, with varied formats of activities, from smaller arena-esque game modes to bigger 3-faction fights. Final Fantasy XIV does a good job with the rewards for their PvP players, with limited edition items such as glam and mounts for the top players. As I still strongly want to advocate for PvP, I heavily encourage you to check out Ricardo. The guy makes amazing PvP content and is firmly working on getting more players into PvP. So here comes the section of topics which leads many to avoid or not trying the game. I'd like to clear some of these things out, and hopefully spark an interest if any of these things have bugged you. The first portion is technical, related to combat. The combat in Final Fantasy XIV is slow in 2 ways. When you make your first character, unlocking new abilities or skills happens very slowly. Here at the screen, you can compare the number of abilities on different levels. Just a reminder, at around level 50 we'll start unlocking new abilities way more frequently, but till then, just be ready to have a limited number of abilities to play around with. The second part many tends to point out is related to the real-time combat. Final Fantasy XIV plays like a tab target MMO, with the combo function, meaning you will have a static rotation with different skills enhancing your next ability. On top of this, there's the GCD, or global cooldown. In Final Fantasy XIV, it is 2.5 seconds long, which is somewhat long compared to other MMOs. One thing often left out is that there is a bunch of OGCDs, or off-global cooldowns, that can be used simultaneously. The 2.5 second GCD really doesn't feel that long when it's paired with the OGCDs, because you'll often have something to press. In addition to this, there's a stat you can stack within the game to make the GCD shorter. Before starting getting into this portion, I'd like to say that our Realm Reborn and even Heavensward were developed with the PS3 in mind. Due to this, there's a few technical limitations from this age, although they are negligible. If this, however, bugs you, just know that the game sees drastic improvement towards Stormblood when the PS4 was around. Beyond this, it improves even more over time. If you struggle with the graphics of the game, there is a very common solution. There's a software called Gshade that functions as an overlay of the game, providing a coating and improving things such as edges, color and lighting. You might have heard someone say, "Nah man, Final Fantasy XIV is too much of an anime and furry game for me." Don't bite into this without taking a look. You'll never find a game with so many different people and so many differences. The races reflect this, and people tend to play the game they want. This is a positive trait of the game, rather than a negative, and the same will apply for you. Just remember, if this is something that bugs you out aesthetically, you shouldn't be alarmed, as the MSQ is formed around you as a solo player. You are free to build your own version of the story. You are never forced to play something you don't like. Just because there are races you perceive in a certain way, you don't have to play them. This is a topic that tends to rub people the wrong way. The monetization of Final Fantasy XIV is somewhat expansive. You first need to buy the game, then you need an active subscription running. There's also expansion releases you'd have to buy, and in addition to this, a cash shop. The cash shop contains mounts, pets, glam, class boosts and story skip. Personally, I'm very anti-shops within games you already pay for. I do, however, have an easier time coping with this shop than compared to WoW, for example. There's 4 reasons for this. The first is that you will essentially play yourself by buying the story skip. The story, again, is a main feature of this game. You'd essentially pay to miss out on something great. 2. Because Final Fantasy isn't hyper-competitive, there really is no reason to buy a class boost. Or more specifically, it doesn't give a player any sort of advantage over you. Number 3. There's no guild selling sanctioned via Square Enix, meaning there's no pay to win or pay to achieve housing, for example. 4. Most would probably agree a shop feels worse when a game feels bad. This isn't the case with Final Fantasy XIV, at least not to this date. I think this opinion would quickly swap if the developers started going in another direction with the development, which infringed on player and community integrity. Buying and installing the game. Actually getting to play is, ironically, a somewhat clunky process. To help with this, there will be some pointers and graphics on the screen to make this easier. Before this, a few things are worth mentioning. The first point is that sales of this game has been suspended for a while. At the time of this video, they will either just have opened up sales again, or just about to open up the sales. Usually there is a free trial available. Have you heard of the critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV with an expanded free trial, which you can play through the entirety of A Realm Reborn and the award-winning Heavensward expansion up to level 60 for free with no restrictions on playtime? Secondly is that there is 2 versions of the game available on PC. Think of those as separate units. You always only use one. One version is Steam, the other is a Square Enix version. Both function just the same, the only difference is where you launch the game and where you get game licenses. This means, once you're committed to a version, you'll be tied to it. In all honesty, I have no idea whether one or the other is better. I just went with Steam for the sake of convenience. Steam. You'll either dabble in the free trial if available, then buy the most recent expansion in order to unlock all the previous ones. Note, despite being a Steam user, you will still get to register a Square Enix user ID. Once your purchase of the Steam version of the most recent X-Pack is complete, you will need to go into the Steam library. Right-click Final Fantasy XIV, Manage, CD keys. Here you will find your CD keys. You will now have to log into the Final Fantasy XIV/Square Enix website. Log on to the site and look for registration codes. Enter item code. This is where you will copy-paste your Steam key. If you're already logged into the game, you might have to exit the game for it to take effect. If you are a Square Enix user, the process is more or less the same, just that you won't have to jump between 2 platforms. When the sales are back up, simply navigating towards the Endwalker sale page, purchase, enter code, all done. Before finishing up the video, there's a few YouTubers I'd like to recommend to you as a new player as well. Mr. Happy1227 got a good library of variety content. ZeplaHQ got a ton of guides about all things Final Fantasy XIV. Fur Daddy is my go-to when it comes to crafting and guild making. The Fashionista, Lulu, makes daily highlights featuring a ton of content creators. So, that's the video. Hope you learned something new, and that you'll grow to love the world of Eorzea just like I did. If you got any recommendations for topics you'd like to see in the future video, let me know. Ciao.